I'm thrilled that we have such a fantastic panel here, and I'm also thrilled that I'm still awake, which is not a small accomplishment. I will survive. So I decided to switch perspectives only because that way I don't have my back to anybody, and if anybody wants to intervene, and I want to put these excellent scholars up front here. You have their bios in the pamphlet, so I won't necessarily go through their names and everything. You can see that it's all there. I want to give as much time as we can to our panelists. And so what I want to do is begin with a very basic question, one that, because each one of these excellent scholars comes from a different country, a different area of expertise, but they're all relatively small countries. What I like to call middle countries, in the fact that they're not global south, which means they have sufficient power to basically have a coherent foreign policy. They have sufficient resources to pursue that foreign policy. And so the question is then, how are they grappling with the China challenge that we've been talking about here today, that Ireland is also grappling with? And so I wanted to start with a very basic question and ask each of the panelists to describe their country's relations with China in their own words, and if they could, to identify what they consider to be the strengths and weaknesses, and finally, to compare and contrast that with what you're hearing today about what Ireland's going through. So I guess maybe perhaps we can start with Julie here, and then we can kind of work our way down the line.
Yeah, hello, so I'm Julie. Well, actually, I have two countries, Taiwan and Finland, but I'm talking about Finland today. Talking about Taiwan is too heavy for me personally. I have too many friends and family. Well, Finland has always prided itself of being a neutral country, even with its big neighbor, Russia, and also with regard to China, not to provoke those countries, but rather to seize the economic opportunities with China in particular. So when I went to Finland about 9 years ago, everybody was very excited about China. And actually, if you want, you could ask, I was the Confucius Institute director of the only institute in England. But 2 years ago, we closed down. And this is in light of the, I think, geopolitical trend in the West and in EU, that people start to feel very anxious of this kind of entity. And also the relations with China has deteriorated. And with the Russo-Ukrainian war, when Finland realized, okay, thank you. So Finland had a 360-degree turn from being a neutral country to become a NATO member. And in this regard, Finland feel very uneasy with the fact that China is kind of helping Russia in this war. So I think the relationship in the future will go down definitely, but that doesn't mean that the diplomats are just aggressive. Actually, I think Finnish diplomats has been very wise and very diplomatic when they conduct relations with Chinese sides. There hasn't been major these kind of scandals that the media can expose about. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Li-Chen, and I'm from Singapore, but I've been working for 18 years in the United Arab Emirates, in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. Oh, cheers. Okay, so I'll be talking about the UAE and not Singapore, even though Singapore fits that description of a small state as well.
You may talk about Singapore too if you like.
Oh, it's okay. No, I'll do UAE. Again, Singapore is too close.
Okay.
Yeah. So the UAE is, for those of you who don't know, it's a smallish country, about 10 million people, so about twice the size here. But it is pretty small compared to, say, our neighbor Saudi Arabia. Okay, so in that case, it's small. Interesting thing about it is that it's got an expat population that's 90% of the resident population, right? So expats take up 90%, and locals are only 10%. So that's pretty amazing for a small country. Now, so the strongest link between China and the UAE would have to be trade, right? UAE is China's largest trading partner in the Middle East and North African region. And not surprising because it is very much a trade hub in the Middle East, right? So one interesting fact about the trade is that you would generally think, being an oil-rich country, that the export trade would be in the UAE's favor, just like the Saudis sell a lot of oil, Qataris sell a lot of gas. And you would think that the export trade is in the UAE's favor, but actually, I think, and this goes to the strength of the relationship, The UAE is the only Gulf country that has a trade deficit with China. And that's because, UAE imports lots of stuff from China because UAE is a trade hub and a re-export hub, right, for the rest of the region. So it takes in a lot of Chinese goods and sells it on to, let's say, North Africa or something. So the strongest part is trade. But unlike what many of you may think, the strongest part of the trade is not oil exports from the UAE to China, not gas exports either. The strongest part is actually non-oil trade, right? The non-oil trade is the major component of trade between these two countries. So I think something like 70% of all trade is non-oil. So that's, again, another interesting aspect, right? And as we go forward, I actually see that the hydrocarbon trade, that is the single biggest item, would eventually be overtaken by trade in machinery, right? So second biggest item is trade in machinery, imports from China, things like solar equipment and that kind of thing, cars. So I think eventually when things go further, the trade in machinery actually exceed that in hydrocarbons. But the weakest, which just goes to your other question, the weakest point of relationship will probably be the security relationship, right? At the moment, the US is kind of like a security guarantor for the UAE, and China has a much weaker in that respect, but I could talk more about it later.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Yeah, no.
Yes, and I will be talking about the Latvian-China story, which started just around the time when, and that was before Xi Jinping, just before Xi Jinping, when back with the Hu Jintao administration, still China decided to show up in what they call Central and Eastern Europe. If you've spoken to any person from the Baltics, they're going to shiver at the Eastern Europe word, but that's how China saw us. So, and it was a grouping, a funny grouping of 16 countries, perhaps similar in size, but ranging from Tallinn all the way to Tirana, if you'd like. That launched the Latvian policymakers, similar as the other Baltic policymakers, into a reckoning. What do we want? What can we do? What does it mean? At the time, the consensus was, this is the golden ticket. Mm-hmm. We are going to trade like crazy. We're going to do what Western Europe has been doing for decades. We're going to get rich, and these people are going to drink our milk. That's our very important export product. So at the end of the day, throughout the decade that followed, there was a realization that this whole political will did not really lead to real results when it came to trade, which perhaps was a blessing in disguise because we don't have really anything to de-risk from at this point. And not even the milk. But the other thing is that when the US-China trade war was picking up pace, also the understanding, and this is where I take your point about the security guarantees, was that, of course, it is not a debate in the Baltics. Where do we stand in terms of our security? It's absolutely clear that the way things are now, the US is our main, NATO, of course, and within it, the US as the major power is our security guarantee. So there was, so we probably won't be able to, for these two reasons, we won't be able to pursue that early dream, the Latvian dream of trade with China. And then COVID hit, and then but just before COVID hit in 2019, the first, I think, the loudest case of this reckoning was that when a Chinese logistics company, a state-owned logistics company, wanted to invest in a majority stake at the Klaipėda port in Lithuania, the Minister of Defense overrode this deal. So it was this is a NATO port. And then in 2021, the Lithuanian example showed us that China can and will hurt you if they don't like something. And the Latvian politicians realized that we have had a very consistent liberal, pro-Western, transatlantic governments throughout. So we haven't really had that much of a swinging. But the realization was that, first of all, this is not a partner you want to be dependent on. And secondly, we're not going as far as Lithuania is going, but what can we do to maybe find a better Baltic approach, even though we do not agree on everything, but a Baltic
approach. Can you explain the Lithuania example for those who are not familiar, just so we're put the context?
Oh, sure. I don't want to drag this out too long because it's the last panel, but just quickly, Lithuania. Lithuania decided to explore the relationship with Taiwan by opening a Taiwanese representative office, which sparked a lot of unhappiness on the Chinese side, including cutting off Lithuania from the customs lists, which paralyzed the exports. But the story has a pre-story in how the Chinese officials, the Chinese diplomats were acting in Lithuania, which actually brought the society to the point where the society was okay with this. Society was ready to take on China, because before that, for example, a pro-Hong Kong democracy protest had a counter-protest organized by Chinese diplomats, which caused a huge outrage in Lithuania, because that is not that is not how the diplomatic protocol works. Another thing, there is a hill of crosses in Šiauliai, which is a very strong, it's a Catholic monument, place for worship, but also it's an anti-communist place where people would put out crosses during the Soviet times, and then it would disappear, and then it would reappear overnight. And there were some tourists who filmed breaking a cross which said "Pray for Hong Kong," and those were mainland Chinese tourists. And of course, again, in the Lithuanian society, that caused another outrage. So the society was right, let's do something here. We're not going to take this. Wasn't the case for the other Baltic states. Now we see that Lithuania does have a complicated relationship. There's practically no diplomatic representation. The Lithuanian embassy in Beijing is empty, from what I hear. We did hear the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gabrielius Landsbergis, say a very interesting phrase that we need to maybe sort of a conversation with Beijing, so maybe there's something happening there. But at the end of the day, Lithuania really punched above its weight and showed that EU unity can be achieved when it's really needed. I'll stop here.
Oh, yeah. Richard, the Czech Republic and Slovakia.
Yeah, thank you. So I will speak a little bit about both Czech Republic and Slovakia. So I'm from Slovakia. I lived for a long time in Czech Republic at the university there. But yeah, it's been very interesting for me to hear also today's panels, discussions with some of you about Ireland's relationship with China. Also because I kind of feel that well, the two countries I'm going to talk about and Ireland, they are similar to Ireland in terms of size. Maybe there are some similarities with history, but very different approach to China. And so I've been asking many people since yesterday why that is the case. And it's frankly very, very inspiring for me personally also to see this. So first of all, China is a topic in Czech Republic especially, but also in Slovakia. And there are political differences between the parties, between presidents. And so basically every change in government, every change in president, that's two different things, mean you have a different approach to China. And so right now, Czech president is quite negative on China, Czech government is quite negative on China, but their predecessors were the opposite. So they were kind of open to engage China. In Slovakia, is exactly opposite. So right now, well, the Slovak president is going to be exchanged for someone who will be more open to China, but especially Slovak government is now kind of much more open towards China. So that's interesting that you have these political differences, and they kind of come back from, well, the broad, maybe the question of identity or strategic direction of, if a party is more like clearly directed towards the West, EU, NATO, or kind of more open to what many people would call pragmatic. So the word pragmatic engaging is a bad word in our part of the world because it means you're willing to engage Russia and China for business and you're willing to sell values, right? So we often talk about values versus pragmatic approach. So that's why it's quite interesting to hear about Ireland's engagement with China, where it doesn't seem that there are big differences between political parties, and then it seems there is some sort of consensus about this pragmatic approach, and it doesn't seem to be in contradiction to those values. A few more things which I've noticed. Some people mentioned today the word megaphone diplomacy. I would say that's exactly what the Czech Republic is doing, but not Slovakia. And I would maybe even use the example of Taiwan. because, well, that was mentioned also with Lithuania. But another thing is that, as we heard, Ireland doesn't have representation in Taiwan. Both Czech Republic and Slovakia has. Czech Republic has been very vocal on Taiwan. I mean, hosting the Taiwanese Minister of Foreign Affairs. Czech Speaker of the Parliament was in Taiwan. Actually, of the two speakers of two houses, one of them declared he's a Taiwanese when he was there. Maybe you've noticed it was really quite a high-profile visit. On the other hand, I would say that Slovakia is pushing its relationship with Taiwan quite far, but it doesn't do it with much of megaphone diplomacy. It focuses on maybe signing the treaties. Actually, Slovakia hosted Taiwanese Minister of Foreign Affairs, but he came for the GLOBSEC, so for conference. He didn't have like public welcoming parties. He had that in Prague, not in Bratislava. And I want to point out that I'm not aware of the Chinese diplomacy making any threats to Slovakia for having the representation in Taiwan, for signing a lot of treaties, for allowing Taiwanese Minister of Foreign Affairs to show up in Bratislava. And so I think that's interesting that maybe from my discussion here, it feels that maybe Ireland is very cautious in approaching China and dealing with Taiwan. But I think there is a lot of gray area between what Lithuania and Czech Republic was doing with this kind of more megaphone diplomacy, and kind of that you can still engage Taiwan without, you know, provoking a whole of response. Yeah, and maybe the last thing I want to say, some people mention the word agency, that how much agency a country like Ireland or Czech Republic and Slovakia has. My answer, I think that would be different. Maybe Finbar, you mentioned it today, or someone else. My response would be actually a lot. And you know, my sense is that China is just open to engage and develop relations with whoever. If you are Serbia or Slovakia or opposition or whoever, they will welcome you, they will treat you well if you visit, and so on. And so the changes in relations between China and Czech Republic and China and Slovakia were driven by our attitudes. So if our politicians are willing to engage China and are friendly, China will welcome them. And if not, then the relationship change. You know, these days, as I said, Slovakia's current government is more open to China. So China is reciprocating, and there are conferences, and actually these days there are Slovak disinformation media really kind of often, you know, anti-Semitic and hardcore, you know, pro-Russian hoax spreaders, and so they are welcome in Chinese MFA. And you know, this again underlines what I'm saying, that they just develop relations with whoever. And I remember maybe 5-7 years ago, and I will finish with this, I had a short exchange with one diplomat from the mission in Slovakia, and you know, he asked me why did I criticize them that they gave interview to a disinformation media. And I said, well, I mean, that media is crazy, like, you know, this is not helping you. And they told me, well, but the mainstream media wouldn't talk to us. So they would just talk to whoever. And if mainstream media doesn't talk to them, they will talk to disinformation media. That's not a criticism of mainstream media. I'm just saying that, you know, I think actually we have maybe more agency than we feel when it comes to developing relations with China.
You know, Richard, one thing you just said I want to just reiterate, which is it does seem to me that many countries have more room to talk and to engage with Taipei and the economic elements in Taiwan than they often think they have. And I think the canonical case for me in studying China-Africa is South Africa, because South Africa has the closest relationship with the Communist Party of China on the continent. They have dozens of engagements, but yet you will find not one but two Taipei offices, one in Joburg and one in Cape Town, and they're able to maintain that relationship. So it does seem that there's some maybe conservative or hesitancy here based on what we heard. So building on what you said, again, I want to try to keep a close connection to what we heard about Ireland. Earlier in the day, we heard about these kind of coercive tactics that China is employing. We heard about the example of Confucius Institutes. We heard about pressure on academics. We heard about student groups. We heard about expat communities from Uyghurs, Taiwanese, Hong Kongers, all facing pressure. So I wonder if you could each kind of articulate, maybe we'll start with you this time, Richard, and go backward, or back towards Julie, to talk about how you have or have not seen coercive tactics in your cases that you look at? And if I could add one thing onto that, what are the coercive tactics and how has the country responded to those coercive tactics? And maybe just one more, how effective has the response been? So,
maybe the short response would be, I'm not aware of kind of primarily Chinese diplomats or Chinese actors conducting the coercive tactics. But actually what has happened was that kind of someone from local actors were doing these sort of steps on their behalf. So actually today when I also posed the question, so my think tank, independent think tank in Slovakia, we got in a bit of an incident with the Slovak director of Confucius Institute. And basically the director sent an email to my colleague saying something like, are you not afraid of walking on a street or something like that? And we even responded like, what do you mean? And like we received 2 kind of threatening emails. And we just informed the media about that we are threatened. And that was reported in Slovak media, it got into international European media. That person got fired because he had a job at the university. It was really big, kind of pushback. Similar thing happened in the Czech Republic. So one of a Czech company, and that's interesting, that was a Czech company who had a lot of business in China, was kind of tried to have a PR campaign to improve the image of China. But that was Czech company, and they started paying someone to kind of improve the image of China. And then when this was kind of revealed, there was a major news all over the media. And so that goes back to, what you asked, what was the result? It backfired. So, but then it wasn't even China directly doing that. It was local actors who kind of did some steps on maybe what they believed was on China's behalf. And I think that was at the end counterproductive. And I think it kind of also showed that like when there are these incidents happening related to China, like Slovak and Czech media especially, they really focus on that. It's really kind of read, and that somehow it leads to some follow-ups.
I would definitely agree on the point of free media and how much we feel that on the daily. And had it been a week ago, I would have said very similar situation to what Richard just described. However, today, and I'm not sure if it's actually happening, but a conference was supposed to happen at the University of Latvia, which originally was planned to be an independent association of Asian studies from all Baltic countries. And it just had a rotational sort of venue at the University of Latvia, which had been hijacked by the PRC official agenda. And I do not know how that happened. I was not there. However, people who were critical, who not even critical, but just who touched upon any sensitive topic, including Xinjiang, including Hong Kong, including Taiwan, were thrown out of the program. And the ambassador, the Chinese ambassador to Latvia, is on the program. It's in writing, giving a keynote at that event. Obviously, the colleagues from other Baltic states pulled out and wanted nothing to do with this conference. It's, in my opinion, it's a very clear example of coercion and influence. Who was the primary culprit here? Was it the local players who were somehow amplifying or being proactive, or we do not know that. But what is the good news and the silver lining here is that it was the Latvian media, and not just any media, but the state broadcaster that jumped on the story and in no unclear terms labeled this academic censorship. So there's still hope. Of course, we are more or less protected in the sense that we do not have China Radio International, for example, in our language in Latvia. But I still want to say, even though these cases do happen, I absolutely agree. It's very often the local players who use China, even without the knowledge of Chinese actors, for their political gain. And that is what we have to be on the lookout for.
Interesting.
Yeah, myself, I would agree with the local actors perhaps being a bit proactive in that sense to protect the China-UAE trade or diplomatic interests. So I'll give you an example. At some universities, state-funded universities in the UAE, for example, if you're an academic and your research area is on China, right, you'd have to submit your publication to the university authorities before you send it to an international journal for publication. Now, the local university authorities would apparently read it, and my friends have done it, come back with red marks, and basically at the end says, do not publish, right? So what can you do if that is your research area? You are an academic, right? You need credibility, but you can't publish on your area. So I don't think that comes down from an official Chinese line, because my friends in these institutes tell me that the institutes do not want a phone call from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying that the Chinese ambassador has complained about some publication. And so to preempt that, I think they actually take these actions onto themselves to kind of filter what the faculty says, because as you know, when you publish something, that's your name and the university's name, right? So I think they want to avoid that situation, and it's a local actor thing. And I'll give you another example of a potential case of it could have been coercion, but it was not, because the two countries have got very good relations. They're aligned on a lot of things. So this was a case when, in the run-up to COP28, the Chinese Belt and Road Fund had funded a coal-fired station, first ever coal-fired station in Dubai, a neighboring emirate. And this was a huge project costing billions of dollars. A Chinese Silk Road Fund had come in and put in a bunch of money. And because of the run-up to COP28, Abu Dhabi told Dubai, hey, you know, you can't have a coal-fired plant, right? Because this is fossil fuel plant. You can't have that. It doesn't look good for us. We are hosting COP28, so please don't do this. And it took years for them to negotiate, because the Chinese didn't want to give up the investment, right? Dubai wanted a base load source of energy, because it doesn't have a lot of its own oil or gas. And so there was a lot of negotiations going on. And finally, Abu Dhabi came in and said, look, how much to the Chinese? How much would it take you to back off on this project? Okay, we really can't have a coal-fired station. A lot of negotiations, and finally money came through. Dubai was happy, the Chinese were happy, Abu Dhabi was happy because it looked good, right? So, so that's the case where the Chinese could have stuck their foot in and really said, we're not going to do this. But there was, so basically I don't think there's a lot of coercion coming from the Chinese side. It's the local actors trying to look good or trying to preserve that relationship because it aligns with a lot of their interests, right? A third example, if you don't mind me, of course, where they actually go overboard, and that's with regards to Xinjiang, right? In UAE, they don't say a lot of things about Xinjiang because they don't want to annoy the Chinese, right? But they've even gone overboard, and they have actually allowed the Chinese to maintain what we call black sites, where they actually, for the Xinjiang Chinese who come into the UAE because it's a visa-free regime, sometimes they report them to the Chinese embassy, and then the Xinjiang people, the Uyghurs, get caught and put into these black sites in the UAE, and they're interrogated and have not so friendly conversations with the Chinese, and sometimes they disappear. So again, I think that's probably not an official Chinese line, but it's just that the UAE is trying to show that they are kind of in line with that kind of vision, because the UAE doesn't like extremist movements, and so it wants to have a more secular kind of vision. So I think it aligns with that kind of Chinese policy. So,
Julie, before you go on, I think that this is a really instructive example of how you see that these more open, democratic regimes where you have a free media and a free press, juxtaposed with a place like UAE where they take your article and start redlining it, right? I don't think that would happen in the Czech Republic, right? Or in Latvia or in Finland for that matter. So I think that this really underscores a kind of interesting uniqueness to the environment that you're in right now. By the way, I should say that I heard similar things when I was in Egypt, right, about the way the Egyptians deal with Uyghurs as well. So yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, well, about the coercion, you see there are clear evidences everywhere how the Hong Kong protesters or Uyghurs are being harassed in various ways, sometimes physically. And these clear cases, they are exposed in the media, and then immediately there is an effect. So the Finnish government would take action. That's clear. What concerns me, and it also happening to me, is this kind of gray zone coercion, that it's very difficult to gather a clear evidence and bring it to the media or bring it to the government. And I know Nordic journalists are aware of this problem. They want to find evidences, but they also grapple with the real evidence, right? And in my case, I can give you a very interesting real experience, because Confucius Institute was about to close. We informed the Chinese side, and I think the Chinese embassy know about it, And so they politely, they didn't know the detail of what the Finnish side wants. So the Finnish side actually has the power to decide whether we want the institute or not. We still do. I think compared with some maybe global South countries, Finland do think we decide what we want. But then I think the Chinese embassy already sensed something is going on. So as a director, so one day I got a gift from the Chinese embassy. You can judge whether this is coercion or a gift. So I got a very beautifully, drafted calligraphy. It's a Chinese poem, so you have to read Chinese. And the poem says, breeze, when you do something, breeze come to you. When you do nothing, breeze also come to you. So this is Chinese. You have to guess what the last line is. The line says, whether you do something or nothing, every breeze will come to you. Why do you do anything? So that was a gift to me. I have no evidence to present to the Finnish government. I have been harassed by the Chinese government. And this kind of thing happened to me a lot. I cannot make a legal complaint. And the university leadership will not take this kind of thing as a legal complaint because they don't understand the Chinese point. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think this is a great example, and I just want to highlight one kind of commonality I'm hearing, and one that I myself experienced, which is these local actors who seem to be serving on behalf of Beijing. And in my experience at the University of Texas, and anybody who's interested in this, Josh Rogan has a chapter in his book called The Showdown in Texas, where you can read all about what happened. But there was a local actor who himself was removed from the State Department for close and continuing contacts, who then was hired by the University of Texas and was then showed up with $2 million from some nice Hong Kong businessmen. And we had a dean who was more than happy to say she studied healthcare policy, she knew nothing of China, but as deans do, she wanted to have a China center. So she was happy to establish the UT, University of Texas, CPC. China Policy Center, right? And so the UT CPC was established, despite the fact that I was like, not a good acronym. And when I pushed back, and this goes to the comments earlier, I was an assistant professor. I was in a weak position. My wife at that point was a postdoc. My wife is from China. The dean's response was to fire my wife and to essentially launch a campaign against me getting tenure. And had I not been moved to the University of Notre Dame, I almost certainly would not have been able to pursue an academic career. And this really had to do with this one local actor who was able to capture the dean's attention with a briefcase full of money. So I think that it's very instructive here, and there's a name for this in Chinese. I think it's called taking the foreign boats to come ashore.
Exactly.
Right? And so the fact that there's even a name for this approach, I think underscores the fact that we see it, this kind of consistency, whether it be in the US or Slovakia or UAE. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that commonality. In the last panel, an excellent question was asked, so I'm going to kind of kidnap that question and ask it to you, because I think it's an excellent way to frame it. So if you were placed in charge of the China policy in your country, what would you do? What would be the changes you would make, or how would you engage China in order to advance the interests of your particular country, understanding the highly asymmetric relations that are the kind of natural state of affairs when a small country deals with a large one? And Julie?
Well, you may call me biased, but I think Finland has been too cozy with the big powers. First is Russia, and then China for a long time, until it wakes up because of the war. And so if I were in the seats of the policymakers, I think we have to take our commitment with the Atlantic relations more seriously, and so Finland joined NATO. But with regard to China, Finland should become more vocal in addressing those key issues that we have talked about in line with the concerns of South China Sea and Taiwan issue. Finland has been very silent on those two issues. And I can tell you it's kind of pervasive in the all Nordic country spectrum. It's not just Finland. These Nordic politicians, they are very cautious. They really don't want to ruin the economic relations with China. But I think now the tide has changed, the direction has changed, and they should become more vocal in line with the EU and with the United States on this.
So for me, I think what I would do is, so the traditional maxim in the UAE, among UAE officials, has always been to tell the US, since we're talking about US-China, we can keep economic interests and political security relations separate. Okay, they don't have to fall in the same box. They don't have to be securitized. So please don't mind us if we pursue economic relations with China while we keep you as the security guarantor, the provider of most of our military equipment, etc. So that has been a traditional maxim. But I think in the past 2-3 years, there has been a shift, and I think I would like to bring up to policymakers that there is this shift, and it's very real, that now everything is being securitized, right? So you can't just keep them in separate boxes. So a very good example is in AI, right? We talked about tech, but let me go into a bit about AI. So the UAE is very intent on being an AI leader, right? Especially since it's services-based. UAE doesn't have a lot of local labor, but services is something it can do. So it's been, plonking a whole chunk of money into a lot of AI companies. And it used to be in line with China, in that sense, in AI, going with the Chinese AI companies, whether it's COVID drug-making companies, or electric vehicles, or telecommunications company, they were all in the Chinese. But in the past 2 years, under American pressure, and also because they realized that AI, where the technology is in the US, where the innovation is in the US, right, because of the English language-based learning. So they have actually now said, okay, we are going to just junk all our Chinese investments in AI, and we're going to go with the US, Microsoft, whatever it is. And it's not just AI, right? It's not just about AI. It's about everything to do with AI. So you have telecommunications, right? That's AI. Will the UAE abandon Huawei, right, and go with the American technology like Qualcomm, etc.? What about data centers? Data centers are so very much AI-based. What's going to happen to the equipment in the data centers, which the UAE is hosting, right? How about technologies in space? That's also an AI thing, right? You have U-Space in China that's cooperating with Space 42, a UAE venture. What's going to happen to that, right? So there are all these kinds of questions, and I think I would advise them that these days, with everything being securitized, it's really impossible to put them in separate boxes. And if you want like great technology, especially in AI, you might have to go with the US and that, and perhaps with the less sensitive technology like maybe solar panels, right, or solar inverters, or wind turbines. Okay, you can get them from China. So the boxes have to be a bit different in terms of low-tech economic stuff and high-tech economic stuff. So, yeah.
Great.
For years, our foreign policy has repeated over and over again that we don't have the resource to cover all of the globe. We focus on what matters. So, for example, our investment screening mechanism was absolutely geared towards Russian investment coming into strategic sectors. That's why we were one of the first to speak about media as a strategic sector, not just energy. At the same time, when you have such an actor-specific approach, you're vulnerable to whatever actors are doing. For example, we have a Chinese investment by the daughter company of BGI, aka known as FKA, or what's it called, previously known as Beijing Genomics Institute, and the daughter company is MGI, and it's a genomic sequencing equipment producer. It's based not far from the Riga airport. It was supposed to just produce the machines. It's been running tests. It's been running tests for free. Hey, bring your sample. It's on us. So that kind of thing we have been vulnerable to. That's one thing. So we need to really focus on it. And the other thing is we've been complacent, as other small countries as well. We've been just downloading everything from Brussels. Like, what's the word of the day? How are we calling our China strategy? That's what we're going to do. We haven't been participating in the conversation as much because of the resource thing. And sometimes we have been so behind of the conversation that this is a true story, by the way, this year there was we have this yearly foreign ministers report on foreign policy. I went through it. It had China, but it didn't speak about what we think about de-risking at all. And I said, why don't we write in de-risking in that? And then we realized there's no word in Latvian for that. So I would say we need to, A, be more proactive on the EU level, and be more actor-specific, not just with Russia, but with other challengers.
I think we also don't have a Slovak word for de-risking. So I talked about two countries, so very briefly. About Slovakia, I think the current Slovak government and situation is very bad. Maybe you've noticed the shooting last week or when. It's very simple to say what I would change in current Slovak foreign policy, because I would change basically everything. And kind of the previous position and approach of Slovakia towards China was actually not so bad, because in a way it was never too provocative, it was quite principled, but also it never fell for all the 16+1 and BRI and so on. So Slovakia was never overexcited. Unlike, for instance, even Czech Republic, or you talk about Latvia. Now about Czech Republic, again, if I should kind of compare it with Ireland, I would say a combination of Czech Republic and Ireland would make of a pretty decent approach to China, I would say. If I should focus on Czech Republic, I do think that the megaphone diplomacy is a bit counterproductive often, and it's hiding a lot of complexities and important things. And often you cannot have a proper discussion in Czech Republic, because the discussion would be, do you care about values or profit? And unless, you basically have to care about values, and then you cannot have discussion about de-risking, value chains, and all these sort of things. So I do think that something like that would be important, because also the discussion about China often goes from extreme to extreme. So for instance, the discussion about how dependent a country is on China economically. So at one point there was a belief that, okay, China will be, a very important economic actor. And then, there was the situation that, okay, well, our exports to China are 1 or 2%, so that's not too important. But then people kind of forget to look at value chains and consider things such as, that most of Czech exports would be re-exported via Germany or Netherlands. Then now people are excited that, okay, we import more from Vietnam, that's great, we are not so dependent on China, but they wouldn't realize that actually China exports it to Vietnam and then it comes to you. Mm-hmm. And so I think there just has to be more nuanced and more kind of, more nuanced approach to consider all these complexities.
Yeah, it's great. I think that in my experience, China is really great at helping people see what they want to see. They're the masters of confirmation bias, right? If you're a leftist, they say we're the Communist Party. If you're a rightist, then they give you, that party line. So, it's really amazing to me how effective this is, right? To really, as Richard said a moment ago, engage people across the political spectrum. Certainly in my research in Africa, we've seen that as well. So I had written so much here. I'm trying to find the line that I was looking for. See, you have so many wonderful questions here. You guys have given me so many ideas. Now I have to find what I was writing. I think maybe we can conclude here and then go to some questions from the audience with talking about how you view the future, right? The future of your particular country's engagement with China. Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Do you think that relationship will get closer or further away? And any other kinds of ways you'd like us to understand the trajectory of the relationship as you see it. And maybe this time we can start with Li-Chen, since you guys have been in the middle. We go Li-Chen, Una, and then Julie, and then Richard.
Sure, happy to start. So I think the trajectory is optimistic, right? Because they've got really no point of friction in their relationship, right? So there's confirmation bias. UAE aligns itself very much with China, but I do see a couple of challenges. So one challenge would be the fact that other countries in the region, right, are also after Chinese money, after Chinese goodwill. So one example would be like in Morocco. So the Chinese are in Morocco because of phosphate mining, because of electric vehicles, because of batteries, and because Morocco can export stuff to the EU, right, without tariffs, because they've got a free trade agreement. So that's something that the UAE would have to look out for in terms of a challenger, in terms of investments. Right now, China is the third largest FDI source into the UAE. Behind the US and the UK, like 50% behind the US in volume terms, but still the third largest, having been maybe the 10th largest about 10 years ago. So it's really closed the gap. But I do think it's got a challenger in places like Morocco, which can export duty-free to Europe, right? So that's the first one. And I would see the second challenge as trying to segregate these sectors because of the US-China competition. Now that's going to be really tough because as I mentioned earlier, everything these days is AI-based, right? Even if you think in terms of the UAE wanting to build an extra nuclear reactor, the UAE's got 4 civilian nuclear reactors. It wants to build an additional reactor. And so theoretically, they say, okay, we're going to welcome procurement, we're going to send out an open tender, anybody can participate, including the Chinese, the Russians, and whatever. But everybody knows that because the first 4 reactors were Korean built, and it's on the same site, right? The 5th reactor on that same site would also be Korean built, because you can't have 2 different security systems for the plant, right? It just doesn't work that way operationally. You can't separate the things. So I think one challenge is they're going to have to see that if they cooperate with Korea, it's basically like cooperating with the US, because the technology for the Korean reactors comes from Westinghouse, right? So allies are going to be a really important indicator of where the UAE is going. So if it cooperates with Japan in terms of, say, financing some of these projects, or Korea, that's a good thing, right, in the eyes of the US, right? But on the other hand, if they cooperated with, say, Russia, right, let's say buying some drones from Russia, then that would be a bad signal because, you know, Russia is lumped into the same category as China, so that would look bad in the eyes of the US. So I think going forward, they would have to be very conscious that whatever they do, allies, you know, allies of the US, allies of China, that's going to be a very important indicator in the eyes of the US.
Oh, I just have one projection. It's because we've been working on information manipulation for the past couple of years, and even more intensively so during the past few months. I think we're going to see China as an information, sort of become a more visible and more active player in the European and the Baltic information space, via, again, amplification of local voices that are beneficial for an agenda. Also, we're going to see much more hacking, much more, you know, somebody during a tech conference said that Chinese hackers had been burning through 0 days like there's no tomorrow. Basically, that's because they have a lot of them stacked up. So that's something we're going to see as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so the trajectory, I think, as I mentioned, it was all positive. And 2017 was the peak when President Xi Jinping really visited Finland and gave us 2 pandas, which became a really big problem. I'm not going to talk about the pandas, but then after that, after the peak, it basically went down quite rapidly. And I think, as I mentioned, I think with the alliances with NATO, the future is not going to be brighter. But the Finnish diplomat, they still have this kind of wisdom, which I think I should learn from them, that they still try not to, although everything is more in line with the United States and NATO, I think diplomatically they try to make sure that there is still a functional relationship, communication channel with the Chinese side. I give you one concrete example. Last year, I don't know if you pay attention, there was a big news in the Baltic area that the pipelines in the Baltic Sea and connecting Finland was destroyed. The first reaction, everybody thought it must be the Russians. But after days of investigation, they found out actually it was a big ship registered under Hong Kong flag, so it's a Chinese ship. Polar bear. Yeah, the polar bear that damaged the pipeline in Baltic Sea. You know, and then the boat just went back to St. Petersburg and then went back to China. So I've been asking people, how come the Finnish government did not do anything? And the answer I got, and I don't have any confirmation, this might just be a guess, I got is that actually the Finnish government had dealt with it diplomatically. It's not in the news, but I guess there is some transaction going on. They will compensate, but we will never see it. Yeah, so diplomatically, I think the Finnish government is trying to maintain still a functional relationship. Maybe that's wise.
Richard?
Yeah, so about future trajectory, I think, as I suggested, it will depend on who is in power. So in Czech Republic, the government and president, they're not going to change their approach to China. They are quite negative. Population is quite negative as well. But there is a chance that there will be a shift in another government to the other side, which would be more pragmatic. And then it's anyone's guess if that happens and, you know, to what extent they will recalibrate and change the overall shift. Now in Slovakia, some interesting thing is happening, which I think actually is not discussed so much. We touched upon that today, but you might be familiar about the announcements of Chinese battery plants in Hungary. I mean, we're talking about more than 10 billion euros. So that's interesting that when 16+1 BRI were announced for Central Eastern Europe, for 10 years there was almost no investment. There was a lot of discussion about, oh, China's buying the region, but actually there was almost no investment. And now it's the opposite problem, that almost everyone forgot that there was this sort of thing. But now over 1 or 1.5 years, China announced more than 10 billion euros of investment in Hungary. And I'm mentioning it because some of that, and some of the deals were also announced in Slovakia, more than 1 billion euros. So that's like, from Slovak perspective and the perspective of Chinese investments in a country, that's a game changer. Not that, of course, Slovakia has a lot of other investment, but still, that's quite significant. And so it is a question whether these investments will materialize, and also, and even more important, whether they will benefit the country's economy and so on. And just so you understand, Slovakia, last time I checked, it's the country which is the most dependent on automotive sector. It's like per capita, it produces most car per capita in the world. And so, you know, the whole dynamics with Chinese e-vehicles and batteries and so on has a potential to have major disruption to Slovakia, but all around the Central Europe, which really depends on car manufacturing. It's not really talked about. And so I think this will be very important to observe what will happen, you know, with the Chinese battery plants. Maybe if Chinese e-vehicles will be produced in the region, whether the established manufacturing by the Western European or other manufacturing will keep their position. So we're kind of in an exciting time.
Yeah, for sure. Well, great. As I look at the clock, we have a little bit of time here left for some questions. So maybe we'll take two. I see Alex over here, got his hand up quick.
Yeah, Julie, question for Julie. You mentioned that you were involved or present when your Confucius Institute closed. Can you walk us through briefly what happened, why, and what the aftermath has been, if any?
Great. And maybe we'll take Valina over here.
I think that there were other, I don't want to take away from someone else.
But you haven't asked a question yet today, so the microphone is yours.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed the last panel discussion, and I have several questions, but we will discuss it afterwards. Now, only the UAE, because UAE is actually one of these cases that I made also during our panel discussion about the middle powers. UAE is exactly such a case study where we see how it is stuck between two, you know, worlds in a bifurcation. It's now BRICS Plus member, all of these kind of things. So I would like really to touch upon this a little bit more, to, you know, hear from you whether this is being discussed already, because at some point of time in the future, as I argue, key middle powers will be confronted with either or choices. They will have to pick a side. It's not going to be possible to oscillate. And given what you've outlined about China, but also let's not forget that UAE is one of the most critical hubs right now to bypass Western sanctions for Russia. So a lot of this transactional trade that is happening is actually the Russian trade that is being diverted in both directions, China and Europe. So what is your take, what is your real world experience with this issue, in a sense that is there already a signal that UAE will pick the Anglosphere side? Here specifically I mean, of course, US and the Indo-Pacific allies, not so much Europe. Or do you think that the incentives, you know, from BRICS Plus, from China, the markets, you know, the global south kind of environment, this is going to be the,
Thanks, Valina.
you know, stronger incentive.
So why don't we take those two, and then we're going to have another round of two. And so Julie, why don't you go first, and then Li-Chen.
You know, I think people kind of, in the Western media, there is really a one-sided description of Confucius Institute. To be honest, in the Nordic countries, we don't really have that kind of spying story that you get in Belgium. That one was real. Yeah, but you know, because of this really negative, yeah, unfortunately, I think there are, you know, black sheep, and that ruined the whole operations. So in the Nordic country, I think what happened is basically journalists started to write about the same stories. And then when the story goes to the university, the leaders doesn't like that, because my university, they think that they are the #1 in Finland, which are a very small country. So they don't like bad reputation. So actually it was our decision. And I have been caught in the position that I'm a professor of Chinese study, at the same time director of Confucius Institute. So I have complained to the university. So how do I answer to journalists when I have these two seemingly, not the same kind of hat? And I actually have to say, our leaders made the right decision. They told me, whenever you speak to journalists or to anybody, you speak only as a professor. So at that point, I started to be more direct in saying what has been going on. And eventually the university think we will use our own money to develop Chinese studies, and just that's it. Yeah. So I think in Europe, we should have that kind of power and that kind of confidence to decide how much we want to engage with Chinese.
I mean, I think that's an important lesson for Ireland based on what we heard this morning, right, guys? That if Finland can do it, Ireland can too, right? Li-Chen?
So thank you for the question. I think the UAE is quite unusual among some of the middle powers in not having a really strong ideological focus to their foreign policy, right? So it's actually, as the word you use, is quite pragmatic, right? So I don't think it really thinks that it has to choose all in with the US or all in with China. So my view is that it's quite sector specific, right? Depending on which country can provide the best in class kind of technology for its needs. So I gave you an example of just now the Chinese solar and wind, right? Cheap, best in class quality, available contractors. So they're all in with the Chinese on that, right? It's not like they decide, okay, we're all in the Chinese, so we're going to do all in all sectors. It doesn't work like that, right? So solar and wind renewables, we're going to go with China. But we also need US tech for things like, for things like AI. But it's not just AI. We also need US tech for things like offshore drilling, right? The Chinese don't have that technology because they don't really do a lot of offshore development of oil and gas, but the Europeans have it, right? The Americans have it because of the Gulf of Mexico. Norwegians have it. So we're going to go with Western tech to develop our offshore oil resources and gas resources, right? So it's this kind of picking and choosing depending on the sector, right? What brings the most benefit to the UAE. And I think that's a great approach for them. But in some senses, they don't have the luxury of choice, say, when it comes, what happens to EVs? What happens to fighter jets, right? So the Chinese tried to, the UAE tried to buy Chinese, they bought Chinese fighter jets, right? But these were trainer jets, not the real, the real thing, it's just trainer jets. But they bought it to signal to the US, hey, you know what? You don't want to sell us the F-35s, we have the Chinese jets. But then they parked the Chinese jets at the main air base in the UAE where the American and French planes are, and the US just blew a fuse and said, you're not parking those Chinese jets with their espionage kind of thingies near our jets, so please move it as far away as possible. Don't care where you move it, but just move it off base. And the same thing has happened with the nuclear program. It's an American-Korean-run program, and they said, you know what, among the people you hire, no Pakistanis for obvious reasons because of the scandal with the proliferation. No Russians, no Chinese. So there are certain red lines, and so that's why I say things are quite sector specific in the UAE. It's not about we choose one side or the other. It's which side can give what technology.
It sounds as if, from what you're saying, on the security side, and of course security is, we only have a country, or countries only exist because they have security. No security, no country, right? So it sounds like on the security side that there is quite a bit of leaning towards the Western side. Would you say?
Yeah, so for that, definitely security. But again, even within that, so security is a big thing, right? So air defense, as some of you know, you have many layers. You can have the top layer of air defense for big ballistic missiles. You can have lower level ones for drones, and they don't actually have to be interoperable, right? In this sense, the UAE has chosen Chinese drones, right? Especially for use outside of the UAE. It's not for internal protection, but for their wars in like Yemen and Syria and all that. You can buy Chinese drones, but at the same time, you can buy American fighter jets because those are supposed to be meant to protect domestically, right? So you can, in that sense, have a mix and match even within the defense sphere.
Interesting. All right, let's take 2 more questions, and then we'll go to some quick concluding remarks. I'm looking for somebody perhaps who hasn't asked a question yet Do I have anyone? Yeah. Okay, maybe Teresa, if she hasn't asked one yet.
I haven't asked a single question from the floor.
Yeah, you.
So first of all, my compliments. I've gone to so many conferences, but this is the first time in my whole life I've ever had a panel of this nature. So this is brilliant. My compliments to all of you. What I want to ask is, how can transatlantic relations be improved? Do smaller states feel part of the discussion on transatlantic relations? And what would you advise to improve them?
Great question. And I think Finbar was the first hand I'd seen, and he'd waited so patiently. So maybe we'll take.
Thank you. Quick one for Richard about Czech Republic. You have a president who's a former NATO general, a foreign minister who's a former IPAC member, and a prime minister who's also a China hawk. Is there anything, I thought they would be more forthright with their China policy, because obviously the rhetoric has been strong, but not so much policy. It's still nominally in the 14+1. Is there any reason why it hasn't been a bit more forthright beyond the words? Is there a sense that maybe the retaliation against Lithuania has had a bit of a chilling effect on how they actually execute these things?
Yeah. I think Una, you might think of that as well, the chilling effect question. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting question, the Lithuanian case, because frankly, I think we were all quite surprised by the tactic that the Chinese went to the investors, and of course, Czech Republic is super dependent on German investment and so on. So if there is this sort of, in fact, it's enough if you only create the impression that it may happen for people to consider. But also, I think that. For instance, the president and the prime minister, to some extent, they are pragmatic, and I think they played maybe the game which I think many African leaders do. When they are in a position, they are more, China hawkish. Once they are in power, they realize that maybe it's not too good to fight with China too much. And so I think maybe there was a little bit of this, that in a way, they exchanged the previous representation, so there were no kind of China-friendly steps. But maybe they also realize that there is not that much to win if they push it too far, maybe also in connection to Lithuania. And then maybe this is just me guessing, but I do think there was a bit of peer pressure within the EU. My sense is that many EU partners thought that maybe it's not very productive. I was in Taiwan a few weeks after the speaker of the parliament was there. People at the mission were not excited about that. They thought that maybe that wasn't necessary, all the messaging and so on. So I think maybe, these people realize that maybe it's not, let's not push it too far. And, you mentioned also 16+1, or some people call it 14+1, whatever. But in a way, and that's funny because the foreign minister, before he became foreign minister, he said this is like Warsaw Pact, and that we should leave. And then once he was foreign minister, they asked him, so why you don't leave? And then he said exactly what I've been saying for 10 years. There is nothing to leave. This is not an international organization. It's a beer club. So you just don't show up for a meeting, and that's it. Yes. And in a way, that was, Lithuania got a bit punished because it was part of all this messaging. But Latvia and Estonia were not really punished. They kind of said, you know what, we're not showing up for your meetings. But then maybe Czech Republic just realized that the whole thing is half that. So there is not much happening. So actually, for instance, these days, I've mentioned it that there is like CEE journalists visiting China. But that thing is just happening. And if a Czech journalist wants to come, it's coming. If Latvian journalists want to come, because we are democracies at the end. And so, yes, prime minister or president is not going to meet the Chinese, but that doesn't mean that the platform at different levels is not going to work. And I think that's something which maybe these people didn't realize before they were in power. It's not an organization which you can leave.
Yes, the Latvian and the Estonian adieu to 16+1 was not worded in the same way as the Lithuanian one. It was worded saying, you know what, we really don't think this beer club is helpful, but we do want to pursue the relationship bilaterally and on the EU, via the 27+1 on the EU level. And so to Teresa's question about the transatlantic bit, I think that the Baltic states have actually been reprimanded by other EU members for being too transatlantically minded, having these lobbying groups in Washington, and apparently they're being greeted with "Oh, you again" these days in Washington. So, in that sense, the Baltic approach is the sober understanding that there's nobody else at the end of the day to protect us. I don't know if it's a lesson for all of Europe, probably not. And that just goes to testify that within the European Union there are different situations, different realities, and the beauty of it is that so far we've been able to balance them.
You know, this is such a great panel. I really don't want it to end. So, in that spirit, I will forego my concluding remarks and allow the last two questions. I saw Victoria's hand, and I saw this gentleman over here, to just make them very quick, because the beer awaits us, and we want to keep it cold.
Yeah, so I heard the comments about, they're not really Chinese actors, but actually local actors doing the coercion. But I want to emphasize that this should not be dismissed, because deploying local actors to lobby on behalf of Beijing is actually a really smart strategy, and it's a very conscious strategy. They know this is the most successful way to actually get their messages across. So I just want to convey that.
Great. And this gentleman here with the last question. Better be a good one.
Thank you. I'll try my best. So you're talking from the point of small countries, and I wonder to what extent overseas Chinese are able to influence the public opinion in the respective countries you're talking about. And if so, how?
Well, in Finland, we had an accident that there was a Chinese immigrant who joined one party in Finland, and she actually was found, the media exposed it, that she had a very close relationship with the Chinese Communist Party and the embassy, and then she was kicked out of this party. So I think the Chinese embassy is consciously trying to call up some Chinese immigrants to work for the country, but now we are being more aware, not naive anymore, because there are also evidences that the Chinese has been able to infiltrate into the Finnish parliament as well as the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the Finnish police, usually they are very silent, but in this kind of situation, they have a clear statement, and that the media convey the message to the Chinese side that we are no longer naive about your actions.
Anybody else want to make a last comment?
So in the UAE, you can't become a citizen, right, unless you're local, unless in very rare cases. So we don't really have overseas Chinese as citizens, but what we do have is a big community of Chinese living in the UAE. And the UAE has the largest concentration of Chinese nationals in the Middle East, right, something like 400,000, so it's huge, right? As you can guess, they very much toe the party line, so you don't get, that kind of the effect of the overseas Chinese, but so they all do toe the party line. And to Theresa's question, can I do that? Theresa's question on the Euro-Atlantic relations. So the UAE is very close to the EU, right? But only as far as the EU makes a tangible, it shows a tangible benefit. For example, the EU's policy on CBAM, right, on the carbon emissions, right? Now, UAE is very conscious that if it wants to export its aluminum or steel or chemicals to the EU, then it has to make sure that it's low carbon, right? So they're very conscious of that. But at the same time, it's going to export its high carbon steel, aluminum, and chemicals to, say, China, or to the Middle East, where there isn't that kind of a low carbon policy, right? So you see a kind of a bifurcation of where the trade goes, the product goes, depending on whether it's a low carbon steel or high carbon steel, right, to different markets. So that's where the tangibility of the European relations come in. And same thing with the US. US has put the UAE on the blacklist for money laundering, right? And it stayed there for 2 years. And my students who were in the Ministry of Interior only had one task during the 2 years: get us off that bleeping blacklist. I don't care what you do, you eat, sleep, you get us off that bleeping blacklist, right? And so that's what they had to do. They said, I don't care what you do, you have to kowtow to the US, just get us off the blacklist, because it increases the risk to investors, it increases the cost of borrowing, etc. And so finally they got the UAE off the US FATS list. But they're still on the EU, they still have an EU list, right, which the EU still maintains on money laundering. So if the pressure from the US and the EU becomes tangible, like it affects exports or it affects, interest rates, borrowing rates, then that has a more tangible effect on UAE's policy.
Any last comments? Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, maybe. Sorry, George, and sorry, everyone. But I thought the question on the overseas Chinese, I did some research on that, kind of what is the attitude towards the country China and the Chinese people. And well, in the US, that's of course a big issue. That kind of the negative attitude and relations with China doesn't translate into negative attitude towards the people, which unfortunately happens sometimes. So in Czech Republic and generally Central Europe, we don't have big Chinese diaspora. But actually looking at, for instance, my data from the survey, you do see that that this negative image of China translates into negative image towards the Chinese. And so I think this is something we should be careful about. And so the presence of, because some Chinese are there, of course, but they don't really play much of a role in the national, and certainly not in the sense that they would be, for instance, highlighting like the human rights abuses in China and so on. So yeah, but I just wanted to highlight this, that especially when we kind of talk about the problems with China, of course, we have to be careful about the people.
That's right. Una, would you like a last word?
We have a very small community in Latvia. So small that when the Chinese embassy needed to create an association of Chinese students in Latvia, they couldn't find any. So what they did is they rounded up everyone who had ever studied in China, me included, and wanted them to create. And I think at the end of the day it was established, but it doesn't have one Chinese student on them.
All right. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and close this panel, which I think was fantastic. And maybe just make one quick comment and then turn it over to Alex to close the show. I just have to say that we took, as was said at the beginning, over a year to put this together. And I have to say, by the fact that there are so many of you who are still here and it's 5 o'clock, I think it shows that this has been an amazingly successful discussion. And I really want to thank our panelists who've come from all over Europe, UAE, you even made it from Chicago, to discuss this. And, we've touched on Ireland, transatlantic relations, US-China relations, coercion, Chinese communities, economics, trade, security, ideology. It's hard for me to think of a topic we really haven't covered well here today. So I'm really impressed, and I want to just conclude by thanking the University of Notre Dame and the University College of Dublin for supporting this, and hopefully it's the beginning of a beautiful relationship. So, thank you.